Before we begin, if you enjoy stories that unfold like a movie and leave something glowing in your chest, remember to subscribe to the channel and tap like so this journey finds more people who need to hear it. You won't believe what happened next. It all started on a day that seemed ordinary but changed everything. What you're about to hear is something no one ever forgot. Rafael Almeida woke before his alarms out of habit, as if his bones had become a clock that refused to let him sleep past ambition. He lay still for 2 counts, 3, listening to the soft pulse of the apartment in Florianopolis. The refrigerator hum like faraway surf, the stray dogs bark in the street, a bus sighing at a stop. His phone lit up before his eyes did, slashing the dark with charts and emails, forecasts and reminders. He tapped the screen and saw the first thing he would ignore that day. A calendar alert in bright blue, Bia's piano rehearsal, 6:30 p.m., front row promised. He swiped it aside like a gnat. The second thing hummed 3 beats later, Lucas's soccer practice at 7, bring water and that joke you told last time. He smiled without feeling it and swiped that away too. Money, he told himself, was the only way to make time behave later, to buy back afternoons and vacations and that stranger called rest. Now was for work. Later would be for life. That was the story he'd written in his head so many times it felt like truth. But what happened next, no one could have imagined. In the kitchen, Mariana stood at the stove with her hair coiled into a knot, and her robe belted loosely, flipping tapiocas that steamed and puffed, the smell of coconut rising like a hand that tried to slow you down. She looked up at him with eyes that had not been sleeping well. "Café?" she asked, already pouring. He wore a navy suit that made him look like he belonged inside glass. He kissed her cheek, already thinking about a spreadsheet he had left open on his laptop overnight like a prayer mat. "Big presentation," he said, and the words were both explanation and defense. "Bigger than your promise to Bia?" she asked, voice even, like someone laying a card on a table. He winced and let a grin cover it. "I'll make it, Amber, I always do." She didn't answer. She slid a tapioca onto his plate and then put the spatula down like she had changed her mind about the world. Bia padded into the kitchen with her hair a dark nest and her pajama pants rolled at the ankles. She cradled a sheet of music as if it were a living thing. "The second page," she said, leaning into him, eyes shining with the half-sleep excitement of a day that had something in it she would remember forever. "I finally got the left hand. You should hear it." He glanced at his watch and the digital sweep of seconds looked like money falling. "Tonight," he said, "I'll sit right in front." Lucas skidded in like a small storm, feet slapping tile, soccer ball under his arm though it was breakfast, though there was nowhere to kick it. "Pi, guess what? Coach said I might start today. Today start like a real forward. You're coming, nay?" His son's eyes were green like the shallow parts of the island's bays. Raphael closed his palm over the boy's head and ruffled hair he wouldn't remember later. "Wouldn't miss it," he said, and the promise was the kind that cost nothing at 8 in the morning and everything by nightfall. His heart was pounding faster with every second and he hadn't even left the kitchen yet, not because of love but because of the meeting he could see like a skyline in his mind. Mariana watched him, and something passed between them like an old signal only two people who have shared 1,000 afternoons could read. She said nothing as he left. The elevator clanked. The building woke with a cough. When the doors dinged open downstairs, he stepped into a morning that had been polished by night rain. The air smelled of wet stone and diesel and brine. His driver, a man named Edivaldo who had started to look at him like a ghost, opened the back door. Raphael slid in, checked his tie again and said, "Centro." Bridges lifted themselves out of mist. The city looked like a handful of sunlight someone had dropped into green water. On the highway he scrolled through a cascade of messages. One from his boss, Eduardo, the kind of man who wore shirts that could slice your fingers if you touched the crease. "Board wants numbers that turn heads." Another from a client in Sao Paulo. "Can we move to 7 p.m.? It would be a favor we won't forget." He typed yes to everything and did not notice what it had cost. At the office, glass swallowed clouds whole. The lobby was marble and air conditioning and the sharp perfume of success. He rode up with people who wore watches heavy enough to bruise, and none of them looked at each other because looking is for people who think they have time. The presentation was a small theater, a long table, laptops like eyes. He spoke in a tone he had perfected, the one that made numbers sound like stories and risk look like rain you could dodge between. He made a joke at the beginning to humanize and a promise at the end to hypnotize. Heads nodded like planted things in a wind. Eduardo grinned like a shark in a nature documentary. "Brillante," he said under his breath. His phone, face down, pulsed with messages he wouldn't answer yet. One from Mariana, just a picture of Bia's hands on the piano keys. One from Lucas, a voice note that said, "Pi, I did 10 juggles. 10. Somewhere between a chart and a graph, Raphael's own father flashed across his mind, uninvited. An image of the older man's hands black with grease, the smell of his garage in the working-class neighborhood in Estrado, his voice saying in a tone that saw through everything, "Men who only learn to count money forget how to count hours with the people who count on them." Raphael had filed that away as something old men say when they are tired. There was so much ahead. There was a bonus like a sunrise. He could see it from here. He could feel its warmth. But what happened next no one could have imagined. At 5, the meeting done and victory humming in the carpet, Eduardo swung into Raphael's office without knocking. He perched on the edge of the desk and looked out at the sea like he had bought it. "The client is sliding," he said. "Says they want one more call at 6:30. You're the only person who can keep them from walking." Raphael swallowed. 6:30 meant 7, meant 7:15, meant the exact minutes where Bia's small hands would climb and fall over ivory like birds. He said, "I promised my daughter." The room cooled by a degree. Eduardo stared at him like he had just spoken in a dead dialect. "We are on the edge of something that changes your life," he said, enunciating each syllable so you had to catch it. "You deliver tonight, and the number in your account becomes a new language. You miss it, and you teach your family that your word has a price. Which lesson do you want to give?" The line landed like a punch because it was the kind of cruel that dressed itself as truth. Raphael looked down at his phone where the calendar squares were lined up like soldiers and where his thumb could move 3 seconds and erase a promise. He heard himself say, "I'll call them." The sentence finished, and he felt something in his chest go quiet, not in relief but in retreat. The call stretched like a highway in heat. He said words he didn't remember because they were the kinds of words he had said so often that they had lost the little country inside them. When he stepped into the elevator finally, a sliver of sky had turned the color of peaches. He told himself he could make it if every light turned green, if traffic forgot it was a city, if time bent like reeds. Edivaldo drove like a prayer. The light at the corner of the music school glowed red and wouldn't turn. Raphael stared through the windshield at a door already closing. He trotted up the stairs, breath tearing in his throat like paper. In the hallway he heard the last applause, the kind that is already memory. He froze. His heart was pounding faster with every second, but now it was because he was late to his life. In the little auditorium, folding chairs made the shape of people who had already left. Mariana sat with her back straight, Bia's head against her shoulder. The piano's lid was half closed, like a mouth after a word it wished it could take back. He tried to smile with his eyes and apologized with a rush of useless sound. Bia sat up. The smile she gave him was small and brave, and it killed him. "It's okay," she said, her voice saying the opposite. "I know your work is important." He reached for her and found the air between them heavier than it had ever been. They drove home quiet. The city threw their faces back at them in glass. At a light, Lucas broke the silence from the back seat. "Pi, guess what?" he said softly. "I scored. You can watch my video." And then he swallowed whatever else he had been about to say. There was something there, something that would change everything in the early hours, after the house sank into a silence that sounded like breathing. The building's power flickered. The apartment went dark for a heartbeat and then came back less certain of itself. Raphael couldn't sleep. He stood at the window and looked out at the bridges lit like necklaces, and then went to the hall closet to find the toolbox to check the breaker box in a gesture that made him feel competent in a world where competence had become a job title. On the top shelf, behind a tangle of extension cords and a roll of tape, his fingers brushed something wooden. He pulled it down and dust broke like quiet birds around his face. It was a music box, small and scuffed, with a tile inlay on the lid in a pattern he recognized immediately. It matched the tiles in his father's old garage, the ones the older man had laid one by one on a Sunday while the radio sang Pagode. Raphael turned the crank. The first notes trickled out, hesitant and unsteady, like a child trying to remember a melody in the middle of a storm. He had forgotten this existed. He had forgotten that his father used to wind it after long days and say, with grease in the lines of his palms, that music tells time differently. The lid stuck and then gave. Inside, under the mechanism, there was a folded envelope with his name written in his father's careful, square handwriting. The paper had the smell of machine oil and time. He unfolded it, and his eyes blurred before his heart did. "Mu Filho," the letter began, and his father's voice came up out of the paper as if the older man had been waiting in the walls for this exact night. "I kept meaning to say this in person, but the shop eats hours the way the sea eats sand. When I was your age, I thought money would make my father proud of me. He was a fisherman who measured worth in hands and in who sat at the table. I worked until my eyes were stones. I missed your first school play because someone needed a part machined by morning. I missed the first time you kicked a ball with your left foot because I thought the man with the Mercedes would never come back if I told him to wait. I was wrong about what disappears and what stays. The car has rust in a junkyard, and the part I machined sits forgotten inside something that no longer runs. But I remember the way your face looked the day I didn't miss. I remember the afternoon we ate pastel, and you told me a joke you de-learned, and I laughed so hard I spilled soda on my pants and you looked like the sun. If work is a boat, don't let it become your house. Come home, Filho. If you don't know how, listen for the music in your house. That's the way." Raphael read it twice and then a third time, and each time the words rearranged themselves to show him a different angle. The music box wound down softly. In the morning, he told Mariana about the letter. She didn't hold it like a victory, and she didn't throw it in his face. She held it like a baby bird. "Your father always knew," she said, and then she kissed his wrist where his pulse knocked like someone asking to be let in. But what happened next, no one could have imagined. Saturday morning was the kind of blue that made you think the island had invented sky. Lucas ran ahead with his ball while Raphael tied his shoes on the stairs and told himself 1,000 times that he would be both things today. A man who closed deals and a man who watched his son. He could feel the email vibrating in his pocket like an insect trapped under a glass. The Sao Paulo client wanting just one more assurance, one more clause, one more comma that would make a very rich man richer. He breathed and silenced it. At the field, the grass was a green that had to be believed in. Sweaty kids tied soccer cleats and yelled each other's names with the kind of faith adults envied. Raphael stood with the other parents at the sideline and felt something uncoil in his ribs like a ribbon. Lucas turned, scanned the crowd, found his father and smiled, a small private universe between them. The whistle blew. It was all motion and joy and the squeak of cleats and the bark of coaches. Lucas darted, juked, lifted his little chin with a swagger that came from believing your name would be answered from the sideline. His heart was pounding faster with every second, and now Raphael's was too. They were in rhythm for once. The ball shot in a line so perfect a geometry teacher could have cried. Lucas ran toward it like it was the first star of the night. Another kid, taller, faster, met him there. Knees knocked. Bodies hit the earth. A sound came out of Raphael he would not have recognized as his own if you had played it back to him. The world paused. Lucas lay still. For an instant the sky was a white door. Raphael's legs moved before his mind did. He slid onto the field, knelt, heard a coach saying something about protocol, saw Mariana appear from the other side like a wave. Lucas blinked and made a small sound, and then he said the thing that would undo and redo his father all at once. "Pi, did you see?" Raphael would have promised himself to any god in that moment if it meant he could say yes with truth. He held Lucas's hand and said, "I saw you run like lightning." And then he pressed his forehead to his son's and closed his eyes against the flood inside him. The coach insisted on the clinic, precaution, head injury, clipboard. The waiting room was all beige and antiseptic, and time stretched so long you could use it as rope. The doctor came, Kind eyes, steady voice. Mild concussion, rest, no screens, luck. They went home with a plastic bag of ice and a printed sheet that said nothing about the way a man recalculates his whole life in a parking garage. In the elevator, Raphael looked at his reflection and saw someone who had been handed a map by a man who had loved him and died and who now asked him to use it. Mariana leaned into his shoulder and he felt the weight that was love and the weight that was fear, and the more he held it, the more he could tell the difference. That evening, he sent Eduardo the message he was afraid of. "I won't be able to take the call tonight. Family emergency." Eduardo's reply came fast and clean. "Are you in this or not?" He typed, "I am in this, but I'm also in my life." He didn't send it, he erased it. He typed, "I'll send notes in the morning." He hit send and then turned off his phone and put it in a drawer like a snake. There was something there, something that would change everything. Monday smelled like coffee and compromise. Raphael drove himself instead of letting Edivaldo do it. He watched the island recede in the rearview mirror and thought of bridges that hold things up while nothing touches the water. He sat at his desk and wrote numbers that were honest and a plan that would work without blood. Eduardo paced and used analogies that involved war and hunger and other things they had never truly known. At lunch, Raphael walked past the salad he always ate and stepped outside instead. Down the block, a tiny shop huddled between a clothing boutique and a bakery. The sign over the door was a line in gold paint, Relogios Augusto. The window held a collection of things that had measured other people's seconds: a brass carriage clock, a pendulum whose polish had learned the shape of light, a watch with a split strap that looked like it had been worn by a man who used his hands. A bell chimed when he pushed the door. Inside it smelled like dust and ideas. An old man looked up from under a magnifier that made his eye look like a secret planet. "Bom dia," the man said. "What brings you in, the past or the future?" Raphael laughed despite himself. "Both," he said. "Mostly the part of the present I can't seem to hold." The old man nodded as if that were the most ordinary thing to misplace. "I'm Augusto," he said. "Everyone in this city is either late or early. Very few are on time. Sit." Raphael sat on a stool. He told the man about the music box and the letter without meaning to tell him anything. Words spilled the way gears spill themselves when you take the back off a clock. Augusto listened like it was his job. "Relogios teach a thing most people don't want to learn," the old man said at last. "They teach that if one gear insists on doing all the work, the whole thing grinds. Each piece needs to let another piece move. You can force the mechanism for a while, but it wears teeth down. Then you don't have time anymore. You have broken teeth." He lifted a small pocket watch from a tray and ran his thumb over its back. There was an engraving in delicate script, Para Volter Escute. "My father owned this," Augusto said. "He used to say those words when I got lost in the shop. To return, listen." He put the watch in Raphael's palm. It was heavier than it looked. "Take it," he said. "Bring it back when you know what it says. When you're lost, old men appear with maps disguised as broken things." Raphael returned to the office with the watch in his pocket, pressing into his thigh like a truth. That week he tried to live in both worlds and discovered, like everyone does, that the body cannot be in two places no matter how much the mind lies. He made dinner 3 times and burned one and laughed, and the kids laughed and Mariana laughed, and the laughter was a raft under them all. He got to a meeting late, and Eduardo's silence was a knife he pretended not to feel. On Thursday, Bia asked if he could watch her practice, not the recital, just practice, because that's where the music shows how it was born. He said yes, and then at 5:30 his phone lit with a message that began with the word urgent. He looked at the word and thought about the way urgent isn't always important. He went to Bia's practice anyway. He watched her try, miss, try again, and then find it. In the empty minutes between notes, he saw a version of himself he liked more than rich people ever would. But what happened next, no one could have imagined. The market turned like a fish you thought was sleeping. A deal fell. A client backed away. The room where they kept the air smelled tighter than usual. Eduardo called everyone in and used the word crisis like a sledgehammer. People agreed with him because they were afraid. Raphael looked out the window at the slow way clouds moved above the island and felt a different kind of fear, the kind that makes you see your smallness clearly. He went home and told Mariana while he washed lettuce. "If they fire me," he said, "I'll take the first job that will let me be where I say I'll be." Mariana dried a glass and turned it in the light like a lens. "If they don't fire you?" she asked. He smiled like a man who had found something valuable in a pocket of an old coat. "Then I'll quit." The next day he woke with his mind decided and found that his hands had their own ideas. He drove to work anyway. He sat at his desk. He answered emails. He talked to clients. He told himself maybe he would leave next week when it made more sense. At 5, his phone lit with a picture of Lucas holding a certificate that said fair play in block letters. He had a gap-toothed grin that looked like the side of the island where the beach is all shells. Under the picture, a message. He asked if we could celebrate with Sorvit on the pier. "Are you coming?" He stared at his calendar. He stared at his boss's door. He stood. He walked. Eduardo looked up without expression, a man carved from deadlines. "I'm leaving," Raphael said. "We have 3 projects that," Eduardo began. "I'm leaving the company," Raphael said, and the words came out clean and light and shaped like the inside of his father's letter. "You'll regret it," Eduardo said, not as a curse but as a fact he believed. "Possibly," Raphael said, "but I regret other things more." He left his badge on the desk, the way a detective does in movies when a choice hardens into a road. His heart pounded faster with every second as he crossed the lobby, but now it was for what he was running toward. Outside, the air tasted salty and available. The sky was the kind of blue that has nothing to do with money. On the pier, Lucas held a cup of maracuja sorved up like a sacrament when he saw his father. Bia smiled with her mouth and her eyes. Mariana slid her hand into his like she had been carrying the other half of it this whole time. In that moment, he realized there was no turning back. But what happened next, no one could have imagined. The first week after quitting was a paradox, a quiet so loud it made his ears ring. He woke early out of habit and lay there afraid that the ceiling would collapse out of boredom. He made French toast and almost burned it and pretended he meant to do it that way. He walked Lucas to school and felt the city at an hour he had only ever watched from a car. He lingered outside Bia's classroom and watched her laugh with a girl whose braids were tied with yellow ribbon. It felt like standing outside a theater and listening to the orchestra tune. Around noon he wandered without admitting he was wandering and found himself again at Relogio's Augusto. The bell rang. Augusto looked up, smiled, returned to his tiny screw. "Well?" the old man asked. Raphael set the pocket watch on the counter and turned it so the engraving faced the light. "Paravolter escute," he read aloud. "I think I know," he said, and then he laughed at himself. "No, I don't know anything, but I want to learn." Augusto nodded, the kind of nod that makes a person feel they are not crazy for changing. "Good," he said. "Do you want to learn about time or do you want to learn how to fix watches?" "Both," Raphael said. "And I want to teach my kids to fix something that isn't theirs breaking." Augusto's smile widened. "Come on Saturdays," he said. "Bring them, bring your wife, bring the music box." And so a new kind of week began. Mondays had the smell of coffee and pencil shavings. Raphael took Lucas to school and stayed to help set up cones for practice. He sat in the front rows of classrooms and listened to teachers explain fractions and felt something like reverence. He washed dishes and discovered there are no small dishes when you do them in a house where people love each other. He went running on the beach and found that his body, too, had been waiting for him to come home. On Saturdays, they went to Augusto's. The old man's hands taught Bia the patience of gears, how to feel when something is aligned and when you're forcing it. Lucas learned to listen for clicks and to turn a screwdriver without stripping the slot. Mariana learned to oil a mechanism without drowning it. Raphael learned to sit in the same moment as his people and let it last. They reopened the music box together. Inside, under the song, there was room for something else, a space where you could keep a tiny folded paper. Raphael wrote a new note to his kids and slid it in where another father had once slid a note to a son. It said, "If you ever feel lost, listen to how we laugh." He cranked the handle, and the song rose like steam in a kitchen that had known a lot of dinners. There was something there, something that would change everything. The idea came one afternoon when a neighbor named Dora knocked with a blender that had died and a face that said she could not afford a new one. Raphael took it apart at the dining table while Bia practiced scales and Lucas built a stadium from cardboard. The blender sprang back to life with a little coaxing and a new fuse. Dora cried and then laughed, and then told everyone in their building that Raphael had hands that did not just count money but fix the things people eat with. Strangers began bringing toasters and radios and long-ignored fans. A boy from upstairs asked if Raphael could teach him how to fix his skateboard because his mother said it was a sign that God wanted him to walk more. The apartment turned into a workshop that smelled like Flux and family. Mariana, who had a skill for making something beautiful out of the ordinary, said, "You know, we could open a place. Not a store. A place. Somewhere people bring what's broken and leave knowing how to fix it." Raphael thought of the money he no longer had flowing like a river, and the fear scuttled across his skin like the first drop of cold water when you step into a pool. He looked at his children, at the way Bia listened when he told her what a capacitor did, at the way Lucas explained to Dora's little brother how to wind a cord. He said, "Let's call it Casa do Tempo." Mariana laughed. "House of Time," she said. "People will think we sell calendars." "We'll teach them different," Raphael said. They found a storefront that had once been a stationery store and then a hair salon, and then an empty space with floors that had seen a lot of new beginnings. The rent was not cheap, but it wasn't ridiculous, and the landlord, a woman with a habit of saying "I remember when this street was all gardens," liked the idea because she could see her sons in it. They painted the walls a soft white, and one wall a blue that Bia said looked like the sky after rain. Lucas made a sign with his careful best handwriting, "Casa do Tempo," bring what's broken, leave with time. They opened with a paper banner and Guaraná, and a band that played in the corner for free because the clarinetist had a clock that hadn't chimed since his wife died. People came. They came with things and with stories. A woman brought a radio that had belonged to her brother who had left for the South and never returned. She wanted it to sigh again on Sunday mornings with the samba that made the cleaning feel like dancing. A man brought a toy train that moved forward and then died, and he cried when it moved forward and then backward because his father had fixed things like this for him and had been gone 20 years, and he could remember his father's hands inside his own. Children watched like mechanics with gummy bears. Augusto came on Tuesdays and sat by the window with a loop that made strangers brave. They didn't charge much. Sometimes they didn't charge at all. Sometimes the price was a story. Sometimes it was a recipe. Sometimes it was an hour of time. Someone would watch Lucas's game while Raphael fixed their blender. The city shifted its weight and made room for them. There were still nights when the refrigerator looked like it had swallowed an echo. There were still bills that made the air feel thin. They sold Raphael's watch and his last suit. They canceled a vacation that had been more fantasy than plan. And yet, Raphael had never felt richer. He watched Bia teach a girl named Anna to keep her wrists loose when she played a chord, watched Lucas kneel next to a boy with a stutter, and wait for the sentence to come out without rushing it, watched Mariana talk to an old woman whose husband was gone, and who needed her fan to move the air and her loneliness. He saw dollars move, and he saw something else move deeper and soundless. But what happened next, no one could have imagined. On a Thursday in November, a storm came up the coast like something that had been told to go away and decided it never would. The sky turned iron. The bridges bled red lights. The neighborhood filled with the sound of drains trying and failing. Water came up through places Raphael hadn't known water could come up through. He was at Casa do Tempo, closing early, stacking what could be stacked on higher shelves. Bia was home practicing because she had a performance Saturday that she would think about later like a fairy tale that almost didn't happen. Lucas was at practice that would surely be canceled any second now. Mariana called. "The water," she said, voice steady in that way that made him love her more than anybody had ever loved anything. "It's coming in under the door." He said he was on his way. He was not yet on his way. He looked at things in his hand, a music box, a pocket watch, a radio with its back off. His father's letter lay under the glass on his workbench like a map that had already been used. He shoved tools into a bag. He threw a tarp over the bench. He waded through water that had come to claim old floorboards. Outside, rain was a curtain, a turbine, a hand. He ran. His heart was pounding faster with every second, and for once there was nothing complicated about why. The street had become river. He turned his body sideways to make the least resistance. He rounded the corner into his block. There was a girl on the stoop next to their building, at the height where water catches cars and flips their weird tonnage like paper boats. She tilted a pan and tried to scoop water back toward the street, a gesture both foolish and holy. He grabbed the pan and laughed and then didn't, because above them a window banged and Mariana leaned out and said his name like an answer. Inside the apartment, the water was in their shoes, their rugs, their drawers. They lifted what they could in a strange dance. Raphael grabbed the music box and set it on the highest shelf, and it looked like a small ship in a harbor. He could taste apartment under the clean water smell, the years of cooking, the laundry, the shallow whisper of dust. The building moaned like big ships do in wind. They moved quickly without talking because talk takes time. Lucas pounded up the stairs and into the room, hair plastered, eyes huge, voice high. Coach said come home, he said unnecessarily. He took the bucket from his father's hand and made a game of it because that's what boys do. He breathed rhythm into the flood like a drummer. Bia called from the bedroom. Something in the tone struck the three of them in the same place. They ran. She pointed at the wall where her hands had traced music all week. A dark line was crawling up it like a bruise. The outlet sizzled. Turn off everything, Raphael said, and Mariana was already moving to the breaker. They waited then for the water to decide what kind of story it would tell about their house. The power cut. The city went quiet in a way that was not silence, but the absence of a hum you hadn't even known you loved until it was gone. Later, when the water had stopped rising and the rain had fallen into the kind of whisper that means it is tired of being so dramatic, the four of them sat on the counter with their knees drawn up like kids and ate pão de queijo that had somehow survived and laughed in the delirious way people laugh when the thing that could have been terrible was only medium bad. In the morning, the sun burned a hole through the gray like a coin through paper. The floorboards were swollen. The baseboards were kind. The hallway smelled like old algae. Casa do Tempo had not fared as well. The front door stuck, he had to shoulder it. Inside, the tarps had held like old friends. 12 things had fallen. 7 could be fixed. The rest would become stories. There was a note taped to the window that hadn't been there the night before. It was in a neat hand and it said, "We will help." It was signed by 5 names Raphael did not know. He stepped back and looked up and down the street. People were out in their socks. A woman had a broom like a sword. A teenage boy walked a dog that hated water. The landlord cried on the sidewalk and then told a joke that made her cry harder while laughing. Volunteers came like light to a place that had lost electricity. They brought buckets and mops and food, and a list of names of other people who needed help. Augusto arrived with a toolbox and a plastic bag of brigadeiros that the woman from the bakery had sent for the spirits. They scrubbed and lifted and saved what could be saved. Neighbors he had never seen said, "I heard you help people fix things. Let us fix this." In that moment, he realized there was no turning back. You don't go back to counting money the same way after you see a teenager pull a ruined carpet with his skinny arms until his shirt darkens. After you see your daughter hold a hairdryer like a torch and coax life out of a radio for an old man on a folding chair. After you see your son deliver cups of water to strangers and wait for thank yous like he's learning to collect something valuable. But what happened next, no one could have imagined. Saturday came. The stage at the cultural center had the weak smell of reheated coffee and hope. Bia pressed her fingers into her knees. She had almost canceled. The piano had almost drowned. Raphael stood in the front row in a shirt that was still a little damp around the hem from the day before. He had slept 2 hours and could not have been more awake. The stage lights folded the audience into a kind of darkness that felt like protection. Bia walked out, 12 and also 30 in the way she carried herself. She sat. She placed her hands. She looked out and found her father. He put his hand on his heart. She began. The first few notes were a story we all know, the trying, the missing, the tightening, the release. And then something happened that no one in that room will forget. The lights hummed, flickered, hesitated. You could feel the whole building decide who it would be in this moment, fragile or brave. The power dipped and caught before it could fall. Bia didn't stop. She kept going with a faith that made adults feel small and then big again. His heart was pounding faster with every second, and the only silence in the room was the kind that makes sound more beautiful when it returns. When she finished, the applause was not just about music. It was a noise that honored 100 things that had gone right and 3 that had gone wrong in ways that had taught them about love. After, they walked home in air that had been washed and wrung. Raphael carried the music box under his arm like a baby. Lucas dribbled a ball softly at his side because happiness cannot stand still for long in boys. They cooked dinner together and didn't care that the rice was a little crunchy. Mariana kissed him like she was thanking him for delivering someone to her she thought she had lost. There was something there, something that would change everything. Months turned into a necklace. They could point to each bead and remember the day it belonged to. The day Casa do Tempo taught a half-dozen teenagers how to solder. The day a retired engineer came and started coming every Tuesday to talk about capacitors with anyone who would listen. The day Lucas's team lost and he cried into Raphael's shirt. And then the day they won and he cried anyway because his coach hugged him and said, "You're a good teammate." And that meant more than what the paper printed. The day Bia, who had been shy in the ways you wouldn't notice if you weren't looking, taught a room of adults how to make a simple melody sound like a story. The night Raphael and Mariana argued and raised their voices, and then didn't go to sleep angry and realized that wealth is having someone to tell the truth to and still wake up next to. The old world tried to call him back. Eduardo texted him once with a photo of a resort in Bahia. "This is your bonus not happening." Raphael stared at it and felt nothing except the desire to show his kids the tide pools the next time they went to the beach. Another time, a different friend called with a job offer that had words like equity and travel and handsome package. Raphael said, "Thank you," and put the phone down and picked up a screwdriver and returned to the broken lamp that had belonged to the principal's mother. He found that choosing gets easier when the thing you're choosing is people. In the spring, a boy from their block, 12 and trouble looking for a place to land, started coming at closing time and hanging back as if waiting to be told to leave. Raphael handed him a broom and said, "You know how to use this." The boy smirked like smirks have been used to protect boys since forever and said, "I'm a broom genius." He stayed. He learned to cut wood without losing fingers and to talk without losing pride. He told Raphael one night, "I didn't know men fix things with their hands. I thought that was only on YouTube." In June, Mariana set a table outside on the sidewalk with lemonade and a sign that said, "Bring a plant you've almost killed." She showed people when to cut and when to leave a thing alone. Bia played and the sound folded into evening like something necessary. Lucas and his friends organized a free soccer clinic in the park with cones borrowed from the school. Raphael watched and thought, "We are doing it. We are living, not later now." But what happened next, no one could have imagined. One hot afternoon, a black car pulled up, a car with tinted windows and rims that glittered like a dare. A man stepped out in a shirt that could have bought all the lemonade on the block. He looked familiar in a way that made Raphael's mouth go dry before his brain supplied the name. Sergio Matos, a man whose face appeared in magazines about money. He had once been a client, one of Eduardo's favorites, the kind who shook your hand harder than necessary. Sergio stepped into Casa do Tempo as if the smell of oil might stain him. He looked around at the controlled chaos and lifted a device. "I need this fixed," he said, setting a sleek espresso machine on the counter like a ship on an old dock. He smiled without smiling. "And I want to talk to you." He said the last part like he was offering safety in exchange for something that couldn't be bought. Raphael wiped his hands and nodded to a chair. "We can talk while I take this apart," he said. Sergio sat in front of the glass case that held old watches and looked vaguely as if the past offended him. "We're building a new division," Sergio began. "Community outreach, but make it profitable. Social impact, but with returns. We need a face people trust. You had a name in the market. You have one in this neighborhood. We can pay you a number that erases other numbers." He paused and let the words hang in the air like the smell of expensive cologne. Raphael loosened screws and watched the insides of the machine appear like a map of a city he did not live in anymore. He could feel the old ache, the muscle memory of wanting to be the man who said yes to the room with more marble. He heard something else too, the sound of Bia's laugh in the back with a little girl who'd brought a broken plastic flute, the thud of a ball on the sidewalk where Lucas and two boys played a game with rules only they understood, Mariana's voice in the doorway telling Dona Celeste to sit, please, and she would make a tea for nerves. He looked up at Sergio. "I appreciate it," he said, and felt the truth in the words. "It's generous." He paused to make sure he wasn't being arrogant or defensive or foolish, but only clear. "No." Sergio sat back. He truly looked at Raphael then and saw a man who had chosen his own currency. "You'll regret it," he said, the same sentence Eduardo had used, as if men like this carried one script. Raphael smiled. "I understand why you think that," he said, "but I can tell you with certainty, this is the first time in my life I am not saving for later. I am spending my life on the people I love and the place I live. The returns are immediate." Sergio nodded in a way that suggested the conversation was over between their different countries, but a shred of respect crossed a border anyway. He left his card out of habit. The espresso machine steamed again by evening. The men came back from the grind and sipped new cups and said, "Better than the office." Raphael stood in the doorway and watched and felt time move like wind through a house with all its windows open. In that moment, he realized there was no turning back. Years gathered. They gathered gently, and when they fell it was into each other's arms. Casa do Tempo became a place people gave directions by. Go left at the House of Time. Kids who had once brought their broken toy cars came back taller, with bicycles and breakups and things that needed fixing that weren't mechanical. The boy who called himself a broom genius became an actual genius at measuring and cutting and patience. He apprenticed with Augusto, and then started his own tiny repair business 2 streets over called Tempo Fino, and brought his first paycheck to show Raphael the way men used to bring fish to show their mothers. Augusto's hands shook more over the years and he laughed about it, said time takes its rent in fractions, and then one winter morning he didn't open the shop. The city felt a little looser in the place where he had held it. They gathered at the pier at sunset and threw flowers and told the truth, that old men save us as often as we save them. Raphael kept the pocket watch on a shelf at Casa do Tempo with a note that said, "Para Volter, Escute," and people would stop and read it and touch the glass and go quiet in a way you only go quiet when something has called your name. Bia grew into her music the way trees grow into the wind that pushed at them when they were saplings. She played with a trio, then a small city orchestra, then alone in a room full of strangers whose ears had been waiting for something like this. Lucas played soccer like a boy who had learned that every play is not about the goal, but about how you move around the people you love. He started coaching younger kids on Saturday mornings and taught them a drill he called the laughing ladder, because if you weren't laughing by the time you hit the top you had to go back to the bottom and find your breath. Mariana turned the back corner of Casa do Tempo into a nook that people fell into and stayed. She called it the living room and kept cookies there, and sometimes it seemed like people's sadness walked in, set its bag down for a while, and left lighter. Raphael aged into a face that had lines because he squinted in sunlight at a boy running, lines because he laughed with a woman he had chosen and kept choosing, lines because he cried when a neighbor moved away or died, lines because weather had touched him and he had been outside in it. He learned to count in seasons instead of quarters. He learned to read the sky like his grandfather had read the sea. He learned to be proud when someone told him, "I fixed it myself after you showed me," the way he had once been proud when a number had more zeros. On a warm evening a decade after he had put his badge on a desk and walked away from a salary that had made his stomach tight, he stood in the doorway of Casa do Tempo and watched his family set a table on the sidewalk for dinner. The street hummed with bicycles and the argument of a couple that would end in laughter, and the click of a leash, and the small sound of a neighbor's shutter closing on a window like the blink of an eye. The music box sat in the middle of the table. The pocket watch lay next to it. Bia's hair was up, and she had a habit of gesturing with her whole arm when she told a story about music. Lucas had a scar on his knee from a game he would never forget. Mariana wore a dress the color of the ocean between islands at noon. Raphael looked at them at this, and he felt rich in a way that would have baffled him years ago. It felt like gravity. It felt like a measure that didn't need numbers. But what happened next? No one could have imagined. A car he knew pulled up. It was Eduardo's, an older model than the one he had years ago, and he laughed a little at that. Eduardo stepped out looking less sharp and more human. If growing older is the art of giving up pretending you're never tired. He came toward Raphael with his hands out and not empty. He held a small box. "I've been walking past here for 6 months," he said without preamble. "Every time I thought I would come in, and then I didn't, and then I do, and here I am." He lifted the box and set it on the table between the music box and the watch. Inside was a plaque, Homnagem de Comunidade, it read, and below, "To Casa do Tempo, for teaching us how to fix what matters." Eduardo's eyes were wet in a way that once would have embarrassed him more than hunger. "My daughter," he said, clearing his throat, "she comes here on Tuesdays with the old engineer man. She thinks capacitors are poetry. I didn't know. I was working late." He looked at Raphael like two men who had been on different islands shouting across water. "I wanted to be rich," he said, a confession and a joke and a regret that was only a regret because of how much it took. Raphael put a hand on his shoulder and felt, for a second, the old electricity of ambition, not as an enemy but as a current that you can learn to step out of when you want to walk on the beach. "We are rich," Raphael said, and he meant it in the exact way he would explain to someone who still counted. "We have a house full of chairs that are full. We have a calendar that looks like a garden and not a cage. We have a street we help sweep. We have hands that are never idle when someone we love is doing something important." Eduardo nodded and looked at Mariana and Lucas and Bia, and then he looked up at the sky that had learned how to be blue again after another day. "You won't believe what happened next," he said, and laughed at himself for using a YouTube line. "But my board is funding a community lab. We want to pay your kids to design it." He looked like someone asking permission to learn a new language at 50. "They'll decide if they have time," Mariana said gently, and the way she said it taught him something he would try to carry back to a room with a long table. Later, after dinner on the sidewalk had become a memory that would glow, Raphael wound the music box and let it play while the city grew dark in corners and stayed bright in others. He thought of his father and his grandfather and a fisherman somewhere counting his nets, not because he needed to see how many, but because touching each square reminded him of what he kept. He thought of the boy who had learned to be a broom genius. He thought of every woman who had walked into Casa do Tempo and cried over a radio that sang again. He thought of how the word later had once stood between him and everything, and how now later had become another way to say next Saturday morning on the sidewalk with lemonade and screws. In that moment, he realized there was no turning back, and he didn't want to turn back. And even if he had, the road he had left behind had already been washed in a storm and he had learned to swim. And the moral, the quiet truth that braided itself through every day in a way that made everything else look pale beside it, was simple enough to fit in your pocket and heavy enough to anchor a life. True success isn't a number you chase. It's a table you set with the people who call your name from another room. He had spent years thinking wealth meant stacking paper high enough to see from a balcony. He had been wrong. Wealth meant waking up inside a house where laughter shows you where the light switches are. Wealth meant being the one they saved a seat for. Wealth meant time, not hoeing it into a field called later but throwing seeds into the small, sweet soil of now. So if you are listening in the glow of your screen, if your alarms ring like bells in the dark, if you think the raise or the bonus or the car with the glittering rims will make you a name that echoes, hear this. Listen for your name at home. Follow the music in your house. Follow the laughter. Keep your hands busy with what breaks near you. What you're about to hear is something no one ever forgot. How a man who once counted money learned to count moments. How he discovered that to be rich is to have a family that knows you meant it when you said you'd be there and your key in the door at the time you promised. How he realized that the only fortune that grows the more you spend it is love. That was his tide. That was his return. That was his life, finally lived, not eventually, but now.